People ask all the time, why aren't there more repair videos of Nintendo games? Everyone wants to see a Nintendo game, go underneath the microscope, solder in connectors, replace chips, find cold solder joints, everything under the above. And the real answer is not a lot of them go bad. Even though I have a workbench with a stack of like 8 games right now that are not working. In fact, most of the time you just get dirty contact traces that are on the outside because they're exposed. And I think we'll talk about, but remember, Nintendo's time when they were producing these, you sent the data over to them and they manufactured these. And so they had very good quality assurance. Now, there were things that were not brought up at the time of, hey, people are going to be wanting to play these games 20 years later, 30 years later, and so on. And because of that, we didn't maybe have super longevity standards put in place. But if we go through the order and we look at our different games, we can see what happens. But Nintendo's first quality check was using security screws, these special shaped screws that needed a special bit to open. Now, yes, nowadays it seems like nothing. We go on Amazon, we buy a game bit driver, and boom, we're good to go. But back at the time, you didn't know it was called game bit. Maybe it had to be ordered in a specialty store. There was no online ordering. Maybe you saw it in the back of a magazine and you got to order for it, or you custom made something yourself where you drilled it out. So it was very rare that people at the time got into these cartridges. The other thing was the average person didn't know what's going on in here, and we're going to see that. But if you look, this is a big case. You know, it has a handle. You can see that that's where the motherboard is exposed to you, and you know, when you look in there at angles, you can see some metal pins, so you kind of get the idea, signal in, signal out. But you, as a kid, I always envisioned a giant motherboard in here. Why is this big? And when you open it, I've already undone the screws, and you get rid of this, you flip this over, and this is what you get. This is the board that you get to work with. You get this small board. And you're like, okay, so the rest is just empty. Now, there have been some games that sometimes are different sizes, but let's focus on a main game now. So you get this board. And these boards are made differently, but Nintendo still had very high standards. And the problems with normal Nintendo games, and we're going to see how things change going on down the line, is there's not much to go wrong, and there's not much to always fix. In this case, you have blob chips, and this style of chip, you can't even see the legs of the pin. So when you're checking for trace connectivity, if your contact point goes to anywhere other than a via and it's making connection, well, good luck, because you're not doing anything to that chip. Not doing anything easily. You have some surface mount capacitors. You normally have another little type of piece here. This can vary. Sometimes you'll have through-hole capacitors. Sometimes you'll have resistors, diodes. There's a variety of things, but this is a very basic thing. And then Nintendo then solder masks the entire piece. So even the vias have been covered, which then you don't have a high chance for corrosion. But if you look, you can see that there's just wear on these chips, on these traces here, these contact points, because these cartridges have gone in and out, in and out, in and out, scratch up a little bit, and then they start to oxidize. But you couldn't get more standard than that, or so we thought. You then went to Super Nintendo and you shrunk the size of the cartridge itself down, which is really nice. If you look, it's slightly bigger than what a normal Nintendo Entertainment board is. So when you open up a Super Nintendo, again, you'll find the board just sitting in there freely. This is an important fact because when we talk about this later. And you kind of saw they got rid of the blob chips. So right, they're kind of improving their designs, because these were a pain when you needed to repair, even when Nintendo needed to repair or thought they were going to repair. So you got surface mounted chips, and this will vary depending on the game. You may have multiple chips. Sometimes you see 3 chips where the ROM and the graphics and the sound are all different. You see a through-hole capacitor right here, and then you see 2 through-hole resistors. But the same thing, you have an incredibly clean board. Everything is masked off. All the vias are masked off. You flip it over. Nice, clean, uniform work. It's rare that you have bad solder joints. Now, this game particularly, when I move it like this, you can see a color difference from the pins at the bottom there, from the bottom where it goes in and out, and from where it connects. Because the board, when it's in the case, seals pretty nicely along this line. And so even with oxidation, you don't really get a lot of problems. Until the Nintendo 64 came along. So what was happening by Nintendo 64's time, they changed the design radically inside of the Nintendo 64 cartridge. Now you're thinking, why? Well, what was also really prevalent at the time was renting video games. So these cartridges were just going in and out, and they were getting way more use than what you would have as just a normal home user. It was normal to be renting at the time. You didn't know if a game was bad or good. You had Nintendo Power. What's it going to tell you? That the game it's trying to sell is bad? Come on. So when we open this up, and again, if we look at the size of the chips, okay, yeah, they could fit in here. But something unique happens here. We're not going to see the board. Why? I'll show you why. Where did this one come from? Oh, West Forest Hill Boulevard, Wellington, Florida. Blockbuster Video Wellington, and then this must have been their barcode system, and it's all out. So again, it was this one, being N64, just had 2 screws at the top. Get rid of the back piece, and when we flip this, it's right, we have RF shielding now. We have metal, and we have 2 more Phillips screws. Now, this was to keep, the radio interference and everything in here much safer. You don't have all the electric CD coming through the waves and killing everyone. But this introduced a whole new set of problems in corrosion. Now, this one is pretty clean, but it's very common to see this rusted and then rust spreading and corroding the board because you just have untreated metal. Now, this was inside, so I don't think there was, again, that thought of this untreated metal is going to be exposed to the elements. But sometimes you get these and just this piece has got rust all over it, even holes rusted through it. So when we take out those 2, now this comes out, and here's our board. Looks very similar except for one thing when I take it out. There we go. This has a back piece. It can come out. Irrelevant. What do we see that's going on here? Something different. Do you see it? How can you not see it? They added this little stabilization bracket here, because before, your cartridges and your boards, remember, they were just sitting in the case themselves. So now Nintendo added this little bracket, which was to compensate, I believe, for all the ins and outs of renters. That normally did a big problem, though, and we'll talk about it, because in fact, Nintendo 64 heavily used cartridges are the cartridges that you see the most problems with when comparing Nintendo, Super Nintendo, and N64. So we have the same setup here. We have some resistors. We have a through-hole electrolytic capacitor. We have our chips here and here. That's fine. If we flip it over, same thing. Look at how nicely these vias are masked. A lot of the times on new equipment that you will see now, they will not mask these because it costs money. Okay, but on a lot of a Nintendo 64, when you have this piece here, like this, it's actually very common when corrosion even sets in to see a line across the board and to have that be the location of the broken trace, because this is rubbing. And let's face it, anyone who's rented a cartridge game back in the day, you were sometimes a little more rough with your rented cartridges than your owned cartridges because they weren't yours. You were sending it back to Blockbuster. Let's go ahead and look at this. Now, all three of these, by the way, are reported not to be working, although sometimes they just need a good cleaning. Let's take all three and line these guys up so we can kind of see the evolution. Now, when you do look at cartridges that were made later on in the lines, you do see, like I said, changes on the motherboards with multiple chips and sometimes another capacitor or this or that. It's just all over the place. But yeah, these are the main changes throughout the lines and why we see problems with N64, but we still don't see a lot of problems because Nintendo's quality control was so high. So everyone always asks, where can I buy broken games? I want to start repairing. There's no magic place to buy broken games. So to tell you the truth, it really doesn't happen. These things are so solid. It's very rare that you find games that have been legitimately in someone's collection in a case on a bookshelf that then for some reason magically breaks on its own. These capacitors are, most of the time, these things are unplugged. So these capacitors are empty, drained. Now, sometimes there are repairs, games that have batteries on them for the saved games, and those batteries have a finite life. So those can go bad, they can leak, they can need to be replaced if you want to save correctly. And there's ways to do that without losing the saved signal. But even after that, with Nintendo 64, only some of the initial N64 games had a battery on them, and other ones you had a memory card pack that went in the controller, and then after that you were able to save right to the cartridge and not need a battery. So lots of options. When you look at this stuff, you can see how it kind of evolved, but you can see some changes that maybe were better and maybe were worse. But I think at the time, all of the changes were better at the time. Hopefully this helped explain the changes between the three generations. And we haven't even talked about Sega Genesis and Master System yet, but don't even get me started there. Take care, everybody.